Under the graceful vaults of an ancient castle, a young couple discussed the important issue of entering into a marriage union. The young gentleman was very gallant and insisted that they were destined to be together. The guy sincerely expected that his partner would reciprocate his proposal, but the girl said that she could not enter into an alliance with another man, since she was already in love with a prince named Karen. The young aristocrat remembered the day she first met this amazing heir to the royal throne. At that moment, the descendant of a noble family was just getting up from a soft sofa decorated with gilded carvings. In fact, it was an accident the young beauty looked through the wrong door and did not even imagine that at that moment His Highness was resting there. The crown prince was very surprised by such an unexpected visit. He did not think that someone would accidentally disturb his peace. Karen seemed confused and stunned at the same time, but this did not affect the fact that the girl fell in love with him at first sight. The young lady looked at the prince and could not look away while the guy seemed to share her feelings. The vast majority of commentators mercilessly scolded the main character Jess for his behavior on the pages of the novel. Readers expressed their anger at the actions of this bad man who led a rather ugly life. There was no character in the entire work that could compare with this scoundrel in terms of baseness and cruelty. The thing is that the main character, named Renair, fell in love with this villain and could not imagine her life without him. And when the girl opened up to him with all her soul and entrusted Jess with the most precious thing she had, she paid dearly for it. The guy publicly trampled her feelings and destroyed everything tender and bright that was in their relationship. The poor thing was so upset by her lover's betrayal that she lost the child she had been carrying for several months. Renner's grief knew no bounds, and the longing and suffering burned out her entire soul, with hellish fire leaving a charred and insensitive frame, while the culprit silently looked at the situation. But at some point, Jess suddenly realized that he not only betrayed the girl who loved him, but also lost a part of himself by killing his own child in the womb. The main character remembered how he begged Renner for forgiveness and tried in every way to make amends for his misdeed, but always received a harsh and categorical refusal. And now, looking at herself in the mirror, the girl could not believe that in her new life she was destined to play the role of sister to this difficult man. Her past path ended in a tragic car accident in which her body was destined to perish, and her soul was destined to find a new world in this body. And now she bore the name of Edna Lushan, and was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Demeret, and also the sister of the aforementioned Jess. But despite the fact that her current life was one of comfort, coziness, and solid wealth, there was also room for torment. The fact is that Edna was sick and could spend days in bed recovering from another attack. The two maids who were assigned to look after the young lady tried to alleviate her painful condition. However, the maids were not united in their intentions. One wanted to sincerely help the young girl, while the other was cool about her duties. She quoted the words of their boss, who said that they shouldn't help young Lucian with all their strength, but it would be better to wait until she died and get a promotion. The Duke's eldest daughter was indeed feeling ill, but she had no intention of dying anytime soon. Meanwhile, the maids continued to recall the recent death of the owner of the estate, and said that very soon the estate would change its owners. But Lucian had no intention of dying despite the physical pain she persistently clung to life. However, this struggle between the young teenager and the disease had been going on for a long time, and its outcome was not obvious. Edna already knew the outcome of the novel's plot. In a few years, she would still have to die, and this would be the starting point for Jess, who would begin to commit bad deeds out of grief. And in order to change the course of events, it is necessary to meet Prince Karen as quickly as possible, because with his help, you can find a cure for an incurable disease. So you can live a new life well and happily, but to do this, you should first take care of your own health, get rid of the illness, and get back on your feet. Then, of course, it is necessary to rid the family of all those who betrayed it and tried to seize power, taking advantage of the opportunity. And then it is quite natural that Jess will retain her human appearance and appear before the readers of the novel not as a complete villain, but as a good and positive hero. And Lucian must manage to do all this before the illness has time to develop and confine her to bed until her death. Overcoming the pain, Edna tried to stand up on the bed, forcing her limbs to obey her mental command with an effort of will. But the illness was too strong, and then the young lady reached out to the bell to call the maid. After some time, the large double doors to the bedroom of the Duke's eldest daughter opened. A maid appeared at the door and asked how she could help Mrs. Lushan. By this time, Edna had managed to sit up on her bed, then she asked for help to get to her brother's room. But it was improper to leave the room in a nightgown, so first it was necessary to change clothes, in response to which the girl who arrived noted that guests were supposed to arrive today. Moreover, according to the personal order of Count Benchel Jess's half-brother during the visit of outsiders to the mansion, young Lucian has no right to leave her chambers. It is this cunning family that wants to take over the family estate of Duke Demeretta after the death of the head of the family and his wife during an accident. They told everyone that they moved into the mansion to take care of the remaining young heirs. But in reality, they were simply robbing the house and humiliating the orphans. The greed of the Count and his family knew no bounds. They dragged everything they could carry, not even bothering to be seen by Edna or Jess. It is hard to even imagine how much the villainous relative became rich from the Duke's family tragedy. Moreover, the scoundrels lured the servants to their side, who now unquestioningly obeyed their whims and orders. For example, Melson, who became the head maid. Lucian asked the girl when guests were expected to visit their house, and she replied that at the end of the day, Edna tried to get out of bed, which shocked the maid, who immediately protested that her mistress was not allowed to leave the room. However, the Duke's daughter was determined to change this life, and therefore, overcoming the pain, she continued to try. Clutching the sheet, the young lady collected her thoughts and turned to Melson, who stood frozen in surprise. Then Edna did not ask, but gave the order to her servants as her father and mother had done before. The shocked maid learned that she had to immediately gather all the staff at the designated place. Looking at the ceiling and walls, the maid pretended not to understand what the young mistress wanted. Then Lucian was forced to put pressure on her uncooperative assistant, reminding her who owned this house and everything inside. The family estate of the Duke of Demeretta was famous throughout the region for its beauty, elegance, and wealth. Continuing to insist on the indisputability of her own words as a direct heir, Edna directly asked the girl who she considered her mistress. The answer she heard completely satisfied Lucian, and thus she took the first step towards restoring justice in this incarnation. The servants were very surprised when they heard from Melson this unusual news that the young mistress urgently demands that all the people be gathered for a conversation. The senior maid really didn't like this unexpected activity of the sick girl, because she had already begun to make her plans for life, taking into account her imminent death. Then, having firmly closed the heavy door behind her, the maid announced that she planned to sabotage the instructions of the young heiress of Demeret, and would not go anywhere. The workers began to discuss the situation and decide what to do because they were afraid of both violating the heiress's orders and falling into disfavor with the countess, the actual owner. The girl from the kitchen said that she couldn't go because she was cooking dinner and couldn't move away from the stove because what could be more important than dinner? Which guests were supposed to come to? After some time, an interesting event took place in the courtyard of a beautiful family mansion. Edna greeted those who had arrived and asked where all the other people were, since only 10 people responded to her order. One of the maids replied that many were busy preparing food and therefore could not come at the appointed time. Lucian thought that in her own home she could only rely on these handful of people, and even the head maid openly went over to the invaders' side. Edna understood that for those who did not remain faithful to her lineage, she was just a little sick girl without real power or influence, who was about to give up her soul to God. However, the Duke's eldest daughter, Demeretta, realized that 10 loyal servants were much better than nothing, which meant that she had at least some kind of rear and could act further. Having assessed the situation, Lucian thanked those gathered and decided to get to know her retinue. Learning their names, the closest to the others, was a fair-haired guy named Ralph. Edna handed the letter and money to the servant and then ordered him to take the message to the magical library, wait for an answer, and return while allowing him to keep the change. The boy was extremely puzzled. He didn't even imagine that an ordinary working day could turn into such unexpected adventures for him. And while Ralph, carefully clutching a gold coin in his hand, was heading off to carry out the assignment, Lucian approached one of the maids and asked if she remembered her name correctly. Mooney? The embarrassed girl replied that her name was Hein. Then the mistress asked the maid to be in her chambers at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Edna then hinted that if the maid did everything right, she would receive a generous reward. The letter that Ralph was supposed to deliver contained a message to a relative of Lucian, namely to Archduke Kletos, her biological grandfather on her deceased mother's side. Once upon a time, many years ago, a man disowned his own daughter after he found out that she was pregnant and that the child was conceived before the marriage. However, after the death of the heiress, the grandfather wanted to restore relations with the orphans, but the insidious Benchul couple cut off all contact. As a result, Jess and Edna were abandoned to their fate, finding themselves in the clutches of villains and treacherous traitors. Walking down the corridor of the mansion, Lushan thought about her upcoming plan of revenge, and rage and hatred boiled in her chest. The young lady passionately wanted to take revenge on people who behaved like robbers and cruel exploiters. A sudden attack of a fatal illness forced Edna to grab the wall with her hand to keep from falling. The girl was so lost in her dreams that she even forgot about her serious thoughts of time passing and life slipping through her fingers filled her mind, restricting her movements and preventing her from thinking. Holding onto the rough surface, Lushan thought that she needed to gather her strength and focus on finding a cure as soon as possible. Approached the stairs. She reached out her hand to the railing. She felt like she was losing consciousness, but she still managed to overcome the wave of weakness and stay on her. There was a light knock with knuckles on the massive door covered with beautiful patterns. Little Jess opened the door to see who had disturbed him at such an hour. His own sister was standing on the threshold. The boy was very surprised by her visit. Then Edna asked to let her. The baby seemed excited and scared at the same time. He did not understand at all what was happening and behaved strangely. Lushan asked what was wrong and was very surprised when Jess angrily replied that she was annoying. And then the boy added that she should leave immediately and that she didn't belong here. The very next moment, the young heir of Duke Demeretta received a hefty blow from his sister and began to scream. Today was a day full of surprises for the boy, and he, rubbing the bruise, asked through tears why he was hit so. In response, the girl reminded Jess of his unforgivable behavior because his sister was sick and he didn't visit her at all, and now he even kicked her out when she found the strength to get to his chambers. The boy did not resist. He was ashamed, and he said that he regretted his behavior. The Duke's descendant looked miserable and unhappy. Tears were running down his cheeks, and his thoughts were wandering. Jess listened as Edna told him that she couldn't take care of her brother properly, just because she was so ill at times that she couldn't even stand up. At the same time, Lushan added that the boy is not guilty of anything. He is simply a hostage of circumstances, but he must take into account what is happening and draw the right conclusions. Then the sister reminded Jess that they were left alone in this world, and they had no one else, so the heirs should support each other more than ever. The boy seemed to agree with her arguments, but he felt uneasy talking to a relative after such a long period of time. Noticing that her brother was inclined to agree with Edna, the girl, without waiting for his final decision, dragged the boy. Pouring fresh water from a jug into the bowl, Lushan called her brother and said that she wanted to help him. And while Jess looked at the container with distrust, the sister added that after the procedures, they would go and take a little walk, to which the boy noted that his aunt had told him not to leave the room today. While carefully washing the boy, Edna told him that his aunt and uncle were only guests in this house, which belonged to Jess and Lushan by right of birth and inheritance. The boy no longer resisted, but rather made excuses, saying that he still did not understand everything and did not know much. Finally, when the procedures were finished, the young lady laughed and handed her brother a towel so that he could wipe away the traces of his vigorous washing. Closer to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the heirs went to Edna's room, where the maid was already waiting. Hein was surprised to learn that the young mistress wanted to give her some of her jewelry, and in return she was supposed to dress her brother and sister beautifully. Lushan said that she wanted to greet the guests as befits the hosts, in beautiful clothes and in full dress. Edna then added that in this way, the heirs of the Duke of Demeretta would confirm their authority to own the estate. While preening for the guests' visit, the Countess was shocked to learn that the sick girl had not only gotten out of bed and left the room, but had also dared to call the house servants. Melson replied that only a few people responded to the call, and everyone else ignored Edna's order, and continued with. The imposter turned to her husband for help, and suggested that the sick girl had completely lost her mind, to which her husband remarked that she should not worry, but rather focus on the guests. The luxurious dining room was decorated with a huge chandelier with a large number of candles, so that the room was as bright. The long-awaited guests sat at an expensively decorated and served table with exquisite dishes resting on plates and trays opposite them. In addition to simple topics, important business issues related to the upcoming grandiose construction were discussed during the meeting. Count Benchel painted his project in the most favorable light possible. He wanted to attract not only the Duke's capital to its implementation, but also the assets of the families gathered in the hall. Opened noisily, and the eyes of those present involuntarily turned towards the opening. Edna and her younger brother appeared on the threshold. The girl smiled and asked for forgiveness for being late, and then introduced herself as the eldest daughter of the Duke of. Some of those present even stood up from their seats in shock. They were clearly not prepared for such a turn of events. Then Lucian continued her monologue, clarifying that she and her brother were heirs of a noble family and were simply obliged to welcome the dear guest. After all, the eldest daughter cannot miss such an important event as a visit from family friends to the territory of her estate, and then she was surprised to notice that there were no free seats. The Countess was furious. She went to her husband for protection and tried to launch a verbal attack on Edna. Ben Shul had a fit of anger. His hand clutching the cutlery trembled with tension, and he asked the girl who entered if she understood where she was, to which Lucian replied that she was well aware of her location. It was her own home which warmly welcomed guests. Those sitting at the table looked at each other silently. They did not know how to react in such a situation. The elder sister looked at what was happening calmly and with dignity. She had no idea that ruining the enemy's plans could be so fun and enjoyable. The Countess forced a semblance of a smile onto her face and said that she urgently needed to speak with Edna alone, to which Lucian retorted, offering to say everything right here and now in the presence of the honorable guests. But the invader insisted on an audience. Scared, Jess took his sister's hand and asked anxiously what he should do now. Should he? Edna leaned over to the boy and replied that it would be best for the boy to stay with the guests now. And then she added that their heart-to-heart conversation shouldn't take much time, so she'll be back soon. Peace and comfort reigned outside the window of the century-old mansion. But inside, within the walls, truly serious, emotional battles were unfolding. The Countess immediately began to attack the girl, noting the incredibly impudent and inappropriate behavior for a sick aristocrat. She reminded Edna that her body was too weak to leave the confines of her chambers, and especially to go out in public. To which Lucian replied that it was her duty as the mistress of the estate to welcome arriving guests. For Duke Benshul's wife to suppress the wave of rage and indignation that rolled over her. Finally, the cup of patience overflowed, and the woman slapped the brave girl across the face with her palm. The scoundrel accompanied her emotional outburst with a long tirade about how she and her uncle were her guardians and were doing everything to take care of the growing heirs, and therefore they were obliged. Edna replied that judging by this behavior, she and her brother should choose other guardians since the role of the Count's family was not legally secured. Hearing these words, the Countess became furious. She grabbed Lucian by the shoulders and began to Suddenly, a strong male voice came from somewhere behind, ordering the woman to stop assaulting her. And as confirmation, there was a powerful blow from a sword piercing the slabs of the terrace on which the heart-to-heart talk was taking place. The guy looked menacing and determined, drawing attention to himself in such an aggressive way. He introduced himself. His name was Rutman, a knight of Archduke Kletos. He then added that the scene he had seen was a flagrant disrespect for the noble family, and the guy was ready to testify in court if necessary. Through Edna's mind that the appearance of such a serious ally was the best thing that could happen that evening. The girl noticed the coat of arms hanging on the guy's cloak. It depicted a lion on a shield surrounded by laurel leaves. Lucian knew this symbol very well, for which the family of Archduke Kletos, her mother's father, was famous. Apparently, in order to move his representative so quickly, the grandfather used a magic portal spell. Otherwise, how could he have arrived from the north in such a short time? Apparently, the letter Edna had delivered through Ralph had already reached its destination, and the subsequent reply was now before. The elder sister returned to the guest hall under the protection of a valiant defender, the knight of her blood. In this way, guardianship passed from the careless invaders to a truly caring person. Rutman announced to those gathered that from now on, the current head of the Kletos family is the official guardian of the heirs of Duke Dem. The Countess still could not believe what had happened, because all her plans for a happy and comfortable life, due to the tragic death of Edna's parents, were collapsing literally before her eyes. The knight politely suggested that the Count's family leave the mansion immediately, and from this information, Benshul seemed about to burst, thinking that no one would dare to offend the orphans who were under the protection of the Archduke himself. Lucian thought that she was one step closer to finding a cure for Karen, who was under the control of her grandfather's family. Then Edna remembered her brother. He was sitting on a chair and barely understood what had just happened, but he felt that things would get better. Jess happily rushed to meet his sister, believing that now she would really be able to take care of him. However, the next moment, Lucian was suddenly overcome by a fit of bloody coughing. This emotional day had not been in vain for his weakened body. The boy was shocked because the world had just begun to look positive for him. The knight was also stunned by what he saw and rushed to help, but his sharp blade was clearly powerless against the fatal illness that had befallen his new acquaintance. And while the servants carried Lucian out of the room on a stretcher, the maid-hind tried to shield the bloody spectacle from the heir of the family in order to protect his However, Jess did not want to let go of his sister. They had been emotionally distant for so many years that it was unbearable to break this finally restored connection again. The maid found herself in an awkward situation since on the one hand she wanted the best for the boy, but on the other hand, she understood how important his contact with his sister was. Eventually, Edna was put in order, changed, and laid on the bed, and her brother sat down next to her and began to wait for her to finally regain consciousness. Jess thought that losing something long forgotten and suddenly finding it was an incredible torment. Despite his modest age and experience, the boy understood that his sister was very ill, so much so that every day could be the poor girl's last. And every time Lucian began to moan in delirium, the boy stood up and came closer, hoping that Edna would wake up any minute. While unconscious, the girl remembered her mother and said that she missed her very much. Jess watched in horror as his older sister spoke to her deceased parent and said that she really wanted to get to her as soon as possible. Then the boy began to cry and asked Lucien if she really wanted to leave him and go to heaven to her mother. In response to these words, the girl began to regain reality gradually emerged through the outlines of the dream, where Edna saw a loved one who had gone forever, and finally she began to understand that it was only a temporary obsession. Then the patient turned her head and saw her upset brother sitting on the edge of the chair and repeating that he did not want to lose her. However, the baby quickly came to his senses, seeing that his words had a positive effect, and Lucien finally returned from oblivion to the real world. But it was hard enough to control yourself at such a young age, and so Jess relaxed and at the same moment burst into loud sobs. The boy fell face down on the blanket covering his sister and continued to sob, while Edna not only came to, but was able to sit up in bed. She was touched by such a clear change in the appearance of the young heir of Demiret, and asked if he had really spent the whole night at her bed. Through tears, Jess asked his sister to promise that she would never leave him alone, and the girl fulfilled the request. She remembered a situation from a novel she had read when this guy, already an adult, asked his beloved Renner to stay. However, that Jess betrayed his love and locked the girl up, depriving her of freedom and choice. But that was in the book reality, and now in front of her was a very young boy, whose psyche and reactions to the surrounding world were at the stage of active formation. The boy remembered with alarm how during yesterday's attack, his sister had soaked her clothes in scarlet blood. Edna hastened to reassure her brother that she was feeling better, and was going to recover from this nasty disease that sometimes took control of her body. Lucien didn't want to overload the children's brains with the truth that their world was much more complex than it seemed, and that it was divided between humans, demons, and gods. How could she tell Jess that her illness was a consequence of the manifestation of the dark power of demons, which evil creatures sometimes release into the world of people to deprive a person of? So in fact, this is not even a disease, but a curse from another reality, which is why it is very difficult to cope with the illness. Edna remembered Karen, the third prince who in her past incarnation was engaged in studying and fighting such phenomena. Realizing that there was a lot to do, and time was running out with every minute, Lucien, despite her brother's surprise and some objections, tried to get to her feet. It was obvious that Jess was indignant that her sister was again trying to show the activity that had cost her so much the day. In order to somehow calm down, the boy extended his little finger to Lucien and asked her to swear that as soon as she completed urgent matters, she would immediately go to bed to rest. Edna confirmed her words by extending her finger and sealing the promise in this touching way. The girl walked along the corridors of the mansion and was surprised at how quiet and empty it became within its walls. After the events that took place, the estate was clearly empty and seemed, although beautiful, less inhabited. Rootman's watchful eye, the entire family of invaders from the Ben-Shul clan left the territory of Duke Demiret in disgrace. A similar fate befell the servants who betrayed their master in the person of his heirs and went over to the side of the greedy count. On the first floor, Lucien was met by a loyal knight, and after a respectful bow, he informed him that he was personally responsible to the Archduke for the life and health of Edna and Jess. The guy also noted that he would carefully monitor that the attitude of those around him towards the blood relatives of his overlord Kletos was as respectful as. In response to this, the girl noted that finally, after many months, she would be able to sleep peacefully, knowing that there was no conspiracy being hatched against her. The younger brother, who now boldly left his room without his aunt and uncle's permission, watched this dialogue attentively and listened to everything. Jess was very surprised to hear from the subsequent conversation that the older sister was planning to go to her grandfather in person. She had promised not to abandon him, and the relative lived far to the north. The boy couldn't help himself and immediately rushed from his hiding place towards Lucien, grabbing her hand and asking where she was going without him. The impatient little boy immediately accused his sister of breaking the oath she had taken 20 minutes ago. However, Edna immediately disarmed her brother, saying that they would go to their grandfather together and that he needed to calm down and pull himself together as befits the heir of the Duke. Jess's apology, Lushan only smiled and thought that there was still a lot of work to be done with this boy's psyche. After some time, a beautiful gilded carriage drove up to the main entrance, which was supposed to take the heirs on this journey. Edna and her brother were waiting at the porch in warm clothes, and each of them, on the eve of departure, was thinking about something of their own. Giving her parting words to the servants, Lucian noted that although there were fewer people, those who remained had to manage the estate. The Duke's heiress waved her hand and reminded them of the importance of following the instructions and recommendations she had left behind. In response, Hein assured the lady that everything would be fine and wished the heirs a successful trip and a speedy return. The rest of the servants joined in, wishing her a good journey, so Edna left her home with a calm soul. Sitting in the departing carriage, Lushan thought that she had never been so happy and calm. Her past life was much more complicated and difficult because she and her mother got by on tiny earnings and lived in hunger. It all ended with the parent finding herself on the brink of extinction, taking out a large sum of money as a loan, and then suddenly died. And then the daughter was left a truly lonely and unhappy girl with a bunch of problems and without the slightest hope. Now she has a beloved brother, a caring grandfather, devoted servants, and a faithful knight, and also a lot of prospects for the further development of events. Their journey north was not as long as it might seem, and soon the carriage pulled up to one of the magical towers created for quick travel. Lushan asked Rutman if they would use the portal to shorten the distance, and the guy answered in the affirmative. Edna thought about it. She imagined the entire further path and teleportation between the towers, which meant that they would reach their intended destination much faster than expected. Once in the center of the circle, the carriage began to move magically. The sensations were strange and could not be called pleasant, so the brother and sister simply sat patiently. Also, there is no point in looking out the windows while teleporting, so this process is quite boring, although it saves a lot of time. The carriage windows were constantly illuminated by flashes of new movements. Lushan even covered her eyes. Finally, as a result of another flash of light, everything around was filled with a white glow, and this was no longer magic. The carriage stood in the middle of the forest, and the ground trees and everything around was blindingly bright from the snow cover. The next thought that came to the girl's head was that it was quite cold in the north. Jess literally read her mind. He caught her attention and looked closely at his older sister. And then the little boy took off his warm scarf and put it around Edna's neck and shoulders. Thus the boy proved that he was becoming a man who could take care of others. The boy accompanied his actions with a phrase about how as soon as they leave the carriage, they will find themselves outside where it will be even colder, and it is better for his sister. Jess did all this quickly, clearly, without hesitation or thought, so that the boy got on the right path. Lushan was very touched by such concern. She looked at her brother with joy, and understood that he really understood something, which meant that he had every chance of becoming a... The sister gently patted the air on the head, which made him feel embarrassed, and added that this was a very good and worthy deed. And opposite sat the knight. Soon the carriage drove up to the grandfather's estate. It looked more solid and luxurious than the Demeretta family mansion. The courteous servants greeted the Duke's heirs with a respectful bow and closed eyes. The head butler reported that the castle was heated by magic, so the sooner the guests entered, the less time they would have to freeze. The luxury and interior decoration pleasantly surprised the young visitors as they walked along the long and spacious corridors covered with carpeted... The polite servant led the children through the labyrinth of passages and brought them straight to the office of Archduke Klatos, opening the door for his grandchildren. A gray-haired, stately man stood at the table on which lay documents and work equipment, looking out the window, his back turned. The heirs entered the room and froze. They did not want to interrupt their grandfather's thoughts. The brother and sister peered into the appearance of their relative and tried to guess what awaited. At last he turned, and the Duke's children saw the face of the head of the Klatos family, and what struck them most was the swift gaze of his sparkling eyes. Edna curtsied respectfully and greeted the Archduke, who had become the savior and protector of her family. Then the children took turns introducing themselves to their grandfather, and it was clear how much they respected and honored their deceased mother's father. Despite the extremely polite tone, Klatos's face was distorted into a grimace of extreme displeasure and irritation. Edna saw this and quickly asked what they had done wrong to cause such a reaction. In response to these words, the relative asked why they used such a formal and dry tone when talking to their own. Then the man picked up the case from the table and slowly approached the frozen heirs. Having opened the box, the grandfather handed it to the children, and they saw inside 2 unique artifacts of exquisite workmanship. The Archduke explained that these were medallions with the magical property of teleportation. Klatos revealed that they were made many years ago as special birthday gifts for the Duke's heirs, and were meant to become the property of Edna and Jess. Grandfather also added that the teleporter, although powerful, only has 1 charge, allowing one to move directly to the magic tower. The children were very surprised, because only select people could afford artifacts with such properties, since this type of magic was extremely rare and complex. Although movement in space was a reality for this world, implementing a personal teleportation of a person to the tower was not an easy. Lushan replied that she was afraid of seeming ill-mannered, and therefore preferred to begin the conversation with a classic business style, accepted and widespread among no. Then grandfather listened with horror to the story of how Edna had been told a legend her whole life about how her mother had made a mistake, and how her own father had hated her for it. Seeing that the grandfather did not feel any hostility towards his descendants, the girl asked if they could call the Archduke grandfather. For a moment, Klatos paused in thought, as if he were pondering something or weighing some decision. And then the head of the family simply rushed to his grandchildren and hugged them, saying that when his daughter Marcia, their mother, died, it hurt him as much as it did them, and they could call him whatever they liked. Then the grandfather's voice trembled, and suddenly he began to cry, remembering that the real mistake was not made by their deceased parent, but by himself, when he allowed emotions to push away his own daughter. Jess was silent, and tears were welling up in his eyes, because he already understood that the worst thing in life is the loss of loved ones and loneliness. Edna remembered that her mother did not blame her father for the breakup at all, but only mentioned his image with longing and pain, and missed him very much. After these words, the mighty Archduke Klatos fell to his knees, continuing to embrace his descendants, and began to sob as little Jess had cried a few days ago. Finally, when everyone had calmed down, tidied themselves up, and started drinking hot tea, the grandfather asked how long they planned to stay at his place. At first, Lucian assumed that their visit would last for about 2 weeks, but seeing the indignation and surprise on her relative's face, she hastened to add that they might stay for about a month. Klatos remarked that he would be glad every day of their stay in his castle, and it did not matter how long their visit would last, whether it was months. Edna noted that they knew very little about the North, and therefore they would like to learn more about this wonderful and amazing land. Then the relative asked where they. Lushan remembered such an unusual place as the Ice Sword Temple, and expressed her desire to start her journey from there. And then she asked Jess if he wanted to join her, or if he wanted to stay in the castle for now. The younger brother frowned comically and replied that he wanted to be anywhere his sister went, and he didn't care what it was as long as he stayed close. Suddenly, the girl was struck by another attack. Her head began to spin, and she began to lose consciousness. Edna woke up on the floor and saw her brother and grandfather's faces distorted with horror, and they both jumped up from their seats. Jess was the first to run up, but Lushan replied that everything was fine and that she was just a little dizzy. The older sister was glad that the attack passed so quickly and without a bloody cough. She really didn't want to appear before Klatos in such an. However, the illness made itself known again. Edna looked at her relative's surprised face with dim eyes and sank into darkness faster and faster. The Archduke was truly shocked, because he had just put his family affairs with his grandchildren in order, and was afraid of suddenly losing everything. Falling into oblivion, the Duke's heiress looked into the corner of the office and heard a voice calling someone for help, then the sound of doors opening and the stamping of feet. When the girl, in a semi-fainting state, was carried out on a stretcher into the corridor, she kept saying that everything was fine and there was no need to worry about her so much. The grandfather was very surprised and a little confused. He clearly did not expect his granddaughter to faint. Then he suggested that perhaps the cold northern climate was the reason for everything. However, Jess assured Klatos that the change in environment had nothing to do with it, since his sister had been suffering from an unknown illness for a long time, and some time ago, he personally witnessed an attack of bloody coughing. Grandfather never ceased to be amazed by the details about his grandchildren's lives. For him, all this information was clearly. The boy remembered how he kept vigil at the bedside of his sick sister and watched her deliriously talking to their dead mother. Jess then told the Archduke about Edna's visions, and that in her dreams her sister often communicates with the deceased Marcia and wants to go to her. After that, in a breaking voice, the boy told how scared he was to think that his sister might die after her mother. The head of the house, Klytos, was once again amazed at how much pain and suffering his grandchildren had endured at such a young age. Then the grandfather put his arm around the little duke's shoulders and promised that he and his sister would be fine now, because they were under the protection of one of the most influential people in the kingdom. Jess was very pleased to hear such words from his beloved grandfather, because it turned out that by getting rid of his aunt and uncle, he and his sister received much more than they had before. They stood there for a while longer, hugging and supporting each other morally, each thinking how lucky he was to have met. While Edna was unconscious, a special protective magical barrier was installed on her. The door swung open with a noise, and Jess appeared on the threshold, and even from the doorway the boy began shouting to his sister, asking how she was feeling. Lushan sat on the bed and smiled sweetly at her caring brother, who was sincerely worried about the girl. Edna then told her younger brother that she was feeling much better now, but she was a little embarrassed by the trouble she had caused their beloved grandfather, since literally a crowd of servants were tirelessly looking after her. After making sure that his sister was okay, the boy told her about Klytos' words that it was already lunchtime. But if the girl was hungry, he would definitely think of something. Lushan assumed that her brother wanted to have something tasty to eat, so she persuaded her sister to go to the table, but the boy rejected such suspicions, after which Edna took him by both cheeks and began to squeeze them, asking what he felt at such a moment. Jess replied that he really didn't like this procedure, but for his sister's sake he was ready to endure anything. The question of finding a cure became more and more urgent. With each passing month, the fact is that ordinary priests could not create the necessary concentration of divine power. However, Prince Karen's power was so great that it made it easy to work not only with light, but even with dark matters. Sometimes his touch was enough for healing. All that remained was to see him and touch the powerful air of the Emperor. Lushan was thinking about how she could arrange their meeting, explain everything, and get the long-awaited healing as quickly as possible because time was against her. Edna's thoughts, her brother expressed the idea that they were now full members not only of the de Meretta family, but also of the Klytos family. This thought had somehow not occurred to the girl before, and she thought for a while, planning her next step. The prince is not only a skilled and powerful healer, he is also a wonderful person and what's more, incredibly handsome. Lushan could have confessed her love to him and then proposed marriage to unite the strength of her family and the power. Edna thought that if she could arrange their meeting and arouse a certain sympathy in the prince towards her, then she would not only be able to heal herself, but would also have a chance to become a happy wife. Long ago, a young couple in hiding found shelter and refuge in the middle of a dense forest. They settled in a small house deep in the forest where almost no stranger had ever seen. The pregnant girl and the guy chose and arranged this quiet and safe place where they were finally able to stop running. The expectant mother asked her partner for forgiveness because, due to her situation, they were forced to leave the palace walls. But the guy replied that it was not their love that was to blame, but the laws of the empire which did not allow feelings to have the final say. But more than others, he blamed the emperor. Thus, finding themselves on the edge of the world, the couple found peace and comfort, which allowed them to look to the future with hope. After some time, the fugitives had a wonderful dark-haired baby, and soon the girl became pregnant again. When their daughter was born, the lovers were happy because they had already lived in peace and love for quite a long time, keeping an old secret, and even sometimes forgetting about their origin. But one day they were found. It happened at night, and by distracting the enemy, the father and mother gave the children enough time to escape. The boy dragged his younger sister through the dark forest, and looking back, he saw flashes of flame appearing at the site of their secluded refuge. Meanwhile, the parents were surrounded, and their house was ablaze, illuminating the forest with an orange glow. The leader of the hunters did not hide his scarred face, unlike the other mercenaries who remained under black masks. The villains killed the parents, burned the house, and hunted down the children, and they managed to capture the boy first while his sister hid from pursuit for some time. She was scared, confused, and didn't understand what was happening, so she ran through the forest, stopping and turning around from time to time. But the pursuers were hot on her heels and quickly overtook the fugitive, who was rushing without making out the road through the forest thicket. As a result, the little girl did not see the edge of the cliff in the darkness and fell off the cliff, landing on sharp stones. The teenager learned about what happened from the kidnappers when they told the leader that the second child had fallen from a cliff. The boy heard the leader of the pursuers reply that the girl's death did not matter, since this entire branch of the nobility had already been condemned. After some time, the boy stood before a nobleman from a noble family, who was wondering what to do with the bearer of imperial blood. In the end, he decided not to kill the heir, but to raise him to be a real prince, because now the boy looked like an ordinary child from a simple family. Thus, the illegitimate descendant of the imperial throne found himself in the far north, where the temple servants were entrusted with his upbringing. This whole story flashed through Edna's mind as she recalled the past of Prince Karen, who did not know that Renner's sister had survived the fall, lost her memory, and ended up in the Duke's family. Suddenly, Lushan's deep thoughts were interrupted by some extraneous noise, to which the girl turned around. It was Jess. While they were riding in the carriage, the boy was telling his sister something, describing his plans for life, and suddenly it seemed to him that Edna did not notice him at all but was somewhere far away. The sister really didn't listen to her brother, but her thoughts were in a completely different place. Finally, the carriage drove up to the Temple of the Ice Sword, and the girl looked at its outstanding architecture with delight. The structure attracted Edna's attention not because it was a landmark of the North, but because Karen, her possible savior and perhaps even future husband, lived here. Leaving the men right at the entrance, the girl, under a far-fetched pretext, went deeper into the temple in order to find the prince as quickly as possible. But since it was Lucian's first time here, she quickly realized that finding someone in this huge building without outside help was a very difficult task. Then the girl decided to find a suitable assistant who would help narrow down the search, but it turned out to be not so easy. There was not a soul. Finally, Edna met a maid at the stained glass window and asked her a question. Hearing that the lady was looking for the prince, the girl in uniform said that she often met unfamiliar representatives of noble blood who were eager to see. Lushan was a little embarrassed by this turn of events, but she was closer to recovery than ever before, so she was not going to back down. Meanwhile, the maid continued to chatter about Sir Karen, who enjoyed unprecedented popularity among the fair sex. Her story ended with the prince being found in the central garden, where he prefers to meditate at these hours. And finally, the maid added that the temple rules forbid female visitors from approaching Sir Karen. They can only look at him from a respectful distance. Edna thanked the talkative girl for her help and went to personally observe the purpose of her visit, because she now knew where to look for the prince. And although the news that the savior was not yet available for communication was unpleasant, Lucien was still happy that they were getting closer and closer with each pass. But the Duke's heiress did not have time to reach the central garden. She was stopped by a young female voice. In front of her stood a tall, attractive blonde who placed her hand on her chest to introduce herself. The stranger's name was Josephine Lee Felcha, and she wanted to talk to Edna about the prince. The elder sister was surprised to learn that her conversation with the maid had been overheard, and now she did not know what to expect from this unexpected conversation. Suddenly, the blonde came closer and took Lucian's brush with her hands. She did it carefully and gently, but very quickly, so that the traveler did not even have time to react. It turned out that Josephine was the vice president of the local Karen fan club, and upon learning that a stranger was asking about the guy, she decided to immediately sign. Edna introduced herself, formally mentioning her last name and status, which left Lee Felcha delighted and amazed. The vice president knew this noble family, and even named the exact part of the country where their holdings were located, and then added that their club had a huge number of girls from all over the kingdom. Lushan was shocked that she had inadvertently entered into the society of admirers of the prince, which included not only nobles, but even maids who had come to the north just to work nearby. The next moment, Josephine took out a sparkling brooch and handed it directly into the confused Edna's hands, saying that it was the symbol of their club endowed with the magic for sending pigeon mail. Lushan learned that if she became a full member of the club, she would be able to gain access to any information concerning the prince. However, the elder sister had her own plans, and therefore replied to the vice president that she would refrain from joining their community. The surprised blonde thought for a bit, and then babbled that it was normal and quite natural to hide one's feelings. Many of the active members of the club also refused it. Waving after the departing girl, Lee Felcha shouted that if she suddenly changed her mind, she could always contact her and change her decision. Lushan felt somehow sad at the thought that Karen had turned into something like an idol, inaccessible, surrounded by servility and worship. However, Edna realized that realizing her plan would be much more difficult than she initially thought, which meant that Josephine's contacts could prove useful to some extent. Having received some information, the Duke's daughter decided that it was time for her to return to her brother and the knight, who had been waiting for her all this time near the entrance. However, after a few minutes of wandering through the identical white corridors and stairs, the girl was forced to admit to herself that she was completely lost. However, around the next turn, a picture of a huge garden appeared before her eyes. Probably this location was indicated by the maid as the place of Karen's daytime meditations. At first, the girl was overcome with fear because she already knew about the existing ban on approaching the prince. Then Lushen looked around and, not seeing anyone nearby, decided that there was no one on the territory of the garden, which meant that she could freely visit and examine it. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to an incomprehensible noise, the source of which was clearly somewhere nearby. It was a small, furry black animal that looked like a little wolf cub, a fox and a puppy all at once. The unexpected visitor to the garden settled down on an ancient grave, and when he realized that he had been noticed, he immediately made a pitiful expression on his face and pressed his ears down. Edna wondered how he got there and what he was doing there, and then came closer to meet him. Judging by his reaction, the little ball of fur was clearly not in the best mood right now. Moreover, he was almost crying. Without thinking twice and obeying some inner emotional impulse, the older sister extended her hands to the werewolf. Lushen lifted the little animal high and looked into its big, beautiful, and very intelligent eyes, and it turned out to be much lighter than it seemed. Then Edna hugged the werewolf to herself, and her soul immediately felt somehow calm, and good, one could even say serene. After holding the pet in her arms for a while and observing the garden, the Duke's heiress decided that this was enough for a first acquaintance. The girl placed the animal next to her, and it snorted contentedly, arched its back, and fluffed up its short but impressive tail. Lushen wanted to say something to the werewolf as a farewell, but he quickly ran away somewhere. Then she began to look for his owner with her eyes. Edna was surprised at how easy and cold her new acquaintance turned out to be, and some suspicion crept into her. It is possible that this werewolf was a magical servant or familiar that helps mages cast their spells and enhances certain abilities. The Duke's daughter remembered that in the original work, Karen also had his own pet, a large, intelligent bird. However, she liked this little animal much more than the prince's winged friend because she could cuddle him and he was so cute. Then Lushen noticed an unknown blonde figure coming out from the central garden area. Edna thought that it was time for her to leave, as well as her stay had obviously been prolonged, and she had not warned her companions that she planned to be away for such. Jess was clearly unhappy with the actions of his older sister, who had left him and Rutman in the unknown and alone at the entrance, but he patiently remained silent. The girl looked a little embarrassed and guilty. She tried to find an excuse for such a long absence, but she couldn't come up with anything intelligible. Edna's version that there was nothing to see in the temple, and was surprised by her sudden desire to return to her grandfather. The guide said that he would definitely find something interesting and worthy of the attention of the Archduke's grandchildren, and then he suggested going to the central part of the city. Lushen asked Jess if he wanted to see something himself, and the boy replied that his sister was acting strange because she said she came to the temple to pray. Edna came to her senses and replied that then they should all go together to the nearest church at the temple, to the doors of which the travelers headed. However, inside the church, a surprise awaited them. It turns out that the fan club led by Josephine had already chosen this place for its meeting. Lee Felcha was chattering happily about something being in a crowd of other girls whom Edna did not know, but guessed what they all had in common. Suddenly, distinct footsteps were heard from somewhere near the entrance. Everyone turned around and saw the prince. The guy walked through the door, and Lushen was struck by his modest attire and calm, even indifferent expression on his face. Karen Ferminti de Lucher was the full name of this incredible man, famous not only for his tragic past but also for his incredible present. Edna looked at the prince and could not stop looking. His image was so enchanting and captivating. And the guy was also much taller than she had previously thought. The girl realized this when Karen came closer and stopped looking her straight in the eyes. It turned out that Rutman and Deluche were acquainted. They exchanged pleasantries, and the knight said that he was accompanying the descendants of the Archduke who had arrived in the north and wanted to see the sights. Lushen was incredibly happy that her personal bodyguard had done a huge amount of work for her, without even realizing it because she was still wondering how she should approach the prince. Karen greeted me, introduced himself, and suggested that I call him by his first name without unnecessary titles and formalities. Edna wanted to reciprocate the prince's feelings and had already started to speak, but she stopped mid. The sudden attack made itself known, buckled her legs, and the girl was thrown forward strongly straight towards Delucher. A thought flashed through Lucian's mind that the illness had appeared at the wrong time because she was afraid of making a bad impression on the handsome guy. Meanwhile, her legs had completely given out, but Karen was already nearby. He caught the sick girl and did not let her fall, embracing her. And instead of pain and despair as it had happened before, a wave of peace and relief suddenly swept through Edna's body, and this meant that the prince's touch had begun to have a healing effect on the weak body. A few seconds later, the older sister was already standing firmly on her feet and could not take her eyes off the clear and pure eyes of Delusher, who was still. Finally, Karen decided to break the long pause and called Lucian by name. Probably he wanted to check how she was feeling and whether it was possible to loosen his grip. Lucian in turn also released the prince since she had been holding him all this time and asked for forgiveness for this incident. And at that moment, the club's magical artifact, which Josephine had recently given her, fell to the floor. It was so awkward and shameful for Edna, having risen so high, to fall. The heiress of the Duke of Demeretta was ready to sink into the ground from shame because she was brought to the prince and introduced. And this thing made her involved in the fan club, which lowered her status. Karen was very angry. Apparently, the young man had long-standing scores to settle with this organization, whose members he forbade from approaching him closer than a few. Delusher sternly remarked that it was very mean of her to take advantage of Rotman in order to get close to him. The prince's anger even spread to his fellow knight, and he asked him never to bring this girl here again, even if it was a direct order from the Archduke himself. The escort was shocked by this incident. He shouted after the departing Karen that he would explain everything, but this had no effect. The guy was already hurrying to the exit. From Josephine's group, Edna caught muffled remarks. The young ladies were animatedly discussing what had happened, and admiring the prince's fury. It seemed they liked him in any form. Moreover, the blonde vice president herself openly admired Lucian, who managed to get so close to the object of their adoration, which of course brought the girl lower and lower. The older sister closed her eyes. She had never experienced such shame in her life. But if she told that she received the club pendant after asking about Delusher, it would only get worse. Meanwhile, little Jess was also angry not at Edna's behavior, but at Karen's actions, who dared to speak to his beloved sister in such a tone. The Duke's heiress hastened to calm the boy, saying that an unfortunate misunderstanding had occurred and that there was no need to blow this unpleasant event into something big and serious. It's all about this trinket that was given to her just an hour ago. It's a symbol of the young girls who have been pestering the prince for a long time and restricting his life and movement in every possible way. Lucian bent down and picked up a club brooch from the temple slabs enchanted for pigeon post, while Jess wondered how this item had ended up with his sister. And while Edna was carefully considering the most appropriate answer, the boy continued to call the prince bad words and wonder how such a scoundrel could ever appeal to anyone. Heiress Demeretta thought that she definitely needed to restore her relationship with Karen because a lot depended on it. The older sister also thought about using his sister Renee in her plan, but was inclined to think that it was better to keep this trump card for now. The need to think quickly and a lot suddenly made the girl feel uneasy. She covered her face with her hand and closed her eyes to collect her thoughts. Edna folded her hands in prayer and said in a quiet voice that she had once seen an image of the prince and had dreamed of meeting him ever since. Jess froze in place, thinking about what he had heard, and then asked if they had come to the temple only because his sister had been dreaming about the guy in the picture. Then the brother became completely serious and remembered that in one of the books he had read there was a phrase about how lovesickness exhausts the body and wears out the soul. Apparently Lucian was in just such a situation. The heiress Demeretta did not know what to say next, and with a stupid smile on her face, she confirmed the assumption of the boy who was growing up before her eyes every day. The Ice Sword Temple looked at what had happened calmly and evenly. Its cold white walls had seen many human throwing themselves about, and it seemed that no emotion could shake its peace. Many years ago, when Karen still had a family and he was a little boy, the boy came out of the forest and headed towards his beloved mother. A young and beautiful girl turned around at the sound of crunching branches. She was surrounded by green leaves and white flowers. In front of her stood the heir of imperial blood, holding a funny and cheerful werewolf in his arms with a guilty look. The little prince looked guilty and confused. He pressed the animal to his chest and said that he had just created an animal. The thick trees heard the mother smile and tell her son that in front of him was his personal familiar, a magical pet that could be raised and made very strong. They sat down on chairs near the house, and the woman told Karen that raised in love and divine magic, the beast can even learn to speak, but if abandoned, it will turn into a monster. The young wizard learned that the most important thing for a created creature is sincere love and care, because it is not just an animal, but a real magical friend and faithful assistant. And since then, they often spent time together. The children loved to play with the werewolf, and he listened to them, watched, gradually learned, and matured. When the little wizard was just creating the pet, he didn't know or understand much, And so the animal initially turned out to be very weak and fragile, but Karen managed to save it during the raid. Years have passed since then, and all this time the pet named Kaon grew up with his owner. They went through a lot and now have become true friends, strong, loyal, and inseparable. One day, the prince witnessed an unusual situation for which he was clearly not prepared. Two young ladies hid in the bushes and secretly watched the guy until they were suddenly discovered. The girls, taken by surprise, were not so much embarrassed and depressed as they were shocked by Deluche's reaction to their antics. The prince was angry. He rushed at them and began to shout that they had violated his privacy, invaded his personal life, and should immediately leave the territory. But the fans quickly came to their senses and began to genuinely admire their idol, who had given them so much attention. The guy realized that threats and words did not frighten them, and so he turned away and headed away to where he was not pestered by local fans. As he left, Deluche heard strangers praising his anger and aggression. They found him particularly masculine and attractive at such moments. They chattered, discussing their Karen fan club. And then the prince created a rule that forbade female visitors to the temple from approaching him at close range, hoping to protect their lives from inappropriate encroachments. Rutman stood opposite his friend and tried to explain the situation, saying that it was just a misunderstanding and that the duke's daughter Demeretta was indeed seriously ill. Karen had already calmed down a little and moved on from the incident in the church. He was pleased that the knight was not involved in this and did not follow the orders of his overlord, but the aftertaste had not yet gone away. The guy felt awkward because in his emotional outburst, he had rushed to accuse the representative of a noble family of something that she probably did not want to do. Moreover, when they met, Edna made a very positive impression on the prince, and he began to increasingly lean towards the idea that Sir Rutman was telling the truth and that this was all just an unfortunate accident. Moreover, Karen remembered that when he caught the falling girl and embraced her, he felt something strange, inexplicable, and attractive. The prince looked at his hand and was surprised to realize that it still bore the same touch of lotion that had happened just recently. Analyzing his feelings, the guy came to the conclusion that this feeling was familiar to him. He had experienced it once a very, very long time ago, but he could not remember what it was associated with. However, Deluche thought that he might have imagined all this because he came to church to pray and relax and not to test his nerves and make new acquaintances. Walking around the garden and thinking about what had happened, Karen looked around and then called his faithful pet by name, and he immediately stuck his head out from behind the nearest bush. Sitting on the bench, the prince looked at his familiar in surprise. He was confused by the fact that he had greatly decreased in size, and the owner asked him why he did this. Deluche reached out to the beast's muzzle and gently patted its furry cheek, causing it to close its eyes and then begin to grow in size. Having regained his strength, the werewolf told his master that he had lost his magic as soon as he touched the ancient tombstone, but now everything was fine. Karen was surprised how the familiar managed to move away from the magical tombstone, and the beast said that he was saved by an unknown girl who literally snatched the pet from the clutches of an ancient magical trap. The prince listened to his friend's story and asked if the werewolf could reproduce her features to thank his savior. Unfortunately, the lady was under the protection of a magical amulet, so the pet could not remember her appearance exactly, but only retained her general features, long hair and a beautiful face. In addition, during the reduction, the familiar partially lost his sight and saw everything around him exclusively in black and white, so even the color of the stranger's hair remains a mystery to him. Karen thought that such a description of an unfamiliar girl was very vague, which meant that the search was noticeably more difficult. The prince remembered today's incident with the duke's daughter, but immediately decided that it was just a simple coincidence, and he should think less about this situation. Meanwhile, Lucien was already at home and recalled how her faithful knight tried to settle this unpleasant conflict that flared up literally out of nowhere. Then Edna remembered that in addition to Rutman, she knew another person who could also have a positive influence on the situation, and with a greater probability of success. Of course, because her beloved grandfather is not only the head of the Klados clan, but also the owner of the lands on which the Temple of the Ice Sword is located. The granddaughter turned on all her charm and began to persuade her grandfather to invite Karen to visit them in order to settle the trouble that had arisen once and for all. But the relative was not thrilled with this idea. The owner of the castle considered the prince to be a very impressive young man, but he had no idea what he could talk about with the guy since their interests were very different, although he promised to think about it. Jess followed her out of the room. They went almost everywhere together. The Duke's son paused in the doorway for a few seconds, looked at Kratos, and said that he supported his sister in her desire to settle all issues with this wizard from the temple as soon as possible. The head of the family smiled and asked his grandson if he wanted to go to the upcoming ball, to which the boy thought for a moment and said that he was not burning with such a desire. Then Jess closed the door behind him, closed his eyes, and began to say what had been building up in his soul lately. According to his version, his sister had fallen madly in love with Karen. Kratos was clearly shocked by this news. He never expected that, literally from the doorway, his granddaughter would begin to weave a love affair with a complete stranger. The grandfather jumped up from the sofa and asked the boy to tell him everything he knew on the subject, to which the grandson replied that Edna had never fallen in love with anyone until she saw the photo of the prince. Then the little gossip told his grandfather that the first meeting between Lucian and Delusher went very badly. The guy yelled at her and accused her of being involved with some crazy group of fangirls. The owner of the castle was shocked to learn that some kid dared to insult his granddaughter and even mock her teenage love. He knew Karen a little, and he had previously felt a little sorry for the prince. At the same time, Kratos understood that a direct ban on their dates would only worsen the situation and ignite a real fire of love in the young woman's soul, which he did not really want. The grandson and grandfather were very worried about Edna and thought for a long time about what they could do to resolve the situation without injuries and unnecessary worries. Lucian woke up and sat up in bed from a strange feeling. It seemed to her that someone was actively discussing her person, and she could not get rid of this obsessive feeling. The next morning, in a beautiful family castle filled with magical power, they discussed current news during breakfast. The Duke's eldest daughter literally beamed with happiness when she learned that her grandfather had finally decided to throw a real ball. Kratos noted that his granddaughter must be the most beautiful and therefore she should go to the city as soon as possible and buy a new dress and decent jewelry. Edna immediately broke into a smile and literally beamed with happiness because a great idea had come to her. True, Jess and grandfather, who were sitting at the table, did not take this proposal very kindly, but it consisted of the fact that Sir Karen must be invited to the ball. It was clear that the relatives were worried about the girl, and most of all about her moral and psychological state, because her love seemed to them exclusively in a negative light. However, Kratos could not allow the misunderstanding that had arisen to grow in scale, and therefore he actually sent the prince a personal invitation to the upcoming ball. Lucian was simply happy, because now she would not only have a real chance to restore relations with the guy, but also the opportunity to develop the fragile connection that was emerging between them. Harris Demeretta literally glowed with joy and noted that today was a beautiful day, and the food this morning was incredibly tasty and aromatic like never before. Jess and Grandpa were very pleased to see Edna in such an elevated mood, and so they decided that for the sake of her happiness, they could tolerate some boy who imagined himself to be someone unknown. Meanwhile, at the Ice Sword Temple, they were also preparing for the upcoming holiday, and the guests were discussing and planning their visit. The werewolf approached the prince and asked him to take him with him to this event, as his magical intuition told him that they should be there together. Karen was a little surprised by his familiar's desire, and assumed that he would be uncomfortable there since under the cover of invisibility, someone could step on him or push him. Delusher knew the Archduke as a strong and strong-willed man, and he did not want to get into an awkward situation. But Kaon replied that he would shrink to a small wolf cub, and everyone loved and cuddled them. The prince thought that the owner of the castle would not allow his granddaughter to manipulate him for her whim, and his pet thought that his savior was probably an aristocrat and could well end up at the ball. The young wizard patted his familiar on the cheek and smiled, suggesting that he wanted to be the center of attention, to be properly hugged and petted. Karen thought a little more and eventually agreed to fulfill Kaon's request, but noted that this was an extremely important event for him, so he needed to behave with dignity and not fall flat on his face. Kaon promised that he would behave like a model werewolf puppy and leave only positive memories of himself among the guests at the ball. And the familiar also thought that someday he and his master would still find the means and the way to punish those who killed their family. But he also knew that revenge is a dish that is served cold. And even though their small pack consists of only 2 fighters together, these friends are capable of moving mountains and turning the whole world upside down. Demeretta was in full swing in the city shop for nobles. The new dress, jewelry, and hairstyle, everything was dazzling, and struck the eyes of anyone who had the chance to see this incredible beauty, and indeed many people worked on this image. For several hours now, the shop workers had been busy offering the young lady more and more new dresses and outfits. The older sister didn't even try on all the available clothing options, but not because she didn't have enough time, but because she had already made up her mind and didn't want to look for anything further. The maids who were helping Edna were very upset when they realized that a lot of items from their large collection would remain lying untouched without being tried on. Jess had been patiently waiting for his sister in the next room all this time, and finally when the girl came out, he asked if she was ready for the ball now. Instead of answering, the sister ran up to her brother, hugged him, and showed him to the store employees, noting that the Duke's son must look dazzling, which made the girls very happy. And when the resisting younger brother was taken behind the screen, Edna asked him for forgiveness and smiled slyly, looking after the boy. But not everything was so good and carefree. The healing effect that Karen's touch had on Lucian was gradually ending, which meant that the pain and the risk of possible fainting were returning. To regain some strength, the Duke's daughter opened the door to the guest room where she could sit down and rest. But Edna never expected to see there the man who literally changed all her plans some time ago. Judging by Josephine's face, she was as surprised as the Duke's heiress. However, Leigh Felch immediately came to her senses, jumped up from her seat, and began to joyfully greet the heiress of Demiret, reminding her of the day when they met in the Temple of the Ice Sword. The vice president bowed politely and remarked that from now on Edna could call her simply Joz, thus she wanted to emphasize her benevolent attitude towards the aristocrat. As Edna got to talking, she realized that Josephine had come to town for the same purpose as she had to choose a dress for the upcoming party. Leigh Felsa spoke about her father receiving an invitation to the event, and also shared the news that Prince Karen is also planning to attend the ball. Lushan suddenly felt unwell because she imagined how a crowd of girls from the fan club would surround her betrothed, and he would be defenseless and confused because he would find himself in an awkward situation. The Duke's heiress had already made a lot of efforts to achieve their meeting, and now everything could be destroyed, and Karen would turn away from her forever, or maybe even marry someone else. Edna looked closely at Josephine and asked her if she knew any girls from the club who were not just dreaming of flirting, but were seriously thinking about marrying a wizard from the temple. Leigh Felch laughed and then explained that the prince was certainly handsome, but his status as an illegitimate child in terms of marriage was a deal-breaker for any girl from a noble family. Despite all his virtues, including the presence of magical abilities, Sir Karen remains only a handsome young man with a tragic fate and cannot be considered as a groom. All members of the club understand this and therefore prefer to only observe the prince and discuss his person without taking any active steps aimed at marriage. Edna listened to the vice president and could not believe her ears. It turned out that all this excitement around Deluche was just a bright performance having no other purpose than entertainment. A wave of anger and indignation washed over her, causing Lucian to tighten her grip on the hem of her dress so as not to inadvertently reveal her emotions. The Duke's daughter thought about the fact that a community of fans is not only the desired fame, success, and popularity, it is also a great force that can cover an idol with a glass dome. Edna asked why the girls were behaving like this with Karen. It was unfair and in some ways cruel. Josephine was extremely surprised by such a question. For her club, the prince had always been something like a strange animal that people go to see at the zoo, nothing more. Lushan added that if the young ladies really have warm and bright feelings for Delusher, then they should change the policy of their organization and start to really help him. They have the power not only to provide material support to the guy through membership fees, but also to try to change the opinion of those around him. Then their work will have real effect. Leigh Felcha listened to Edna with her mouth open in amazement. She would never have thought that an aristocrat from a good family would say such words. Then Josephine thought for a moment and suggested that the Duke's daughter had been careless enough to fall in love with an illegitimate heir of imperial blood. Heiress Demeretta noisily put her cup of tea on the saucer. She decided that there was no point in hiding her feelings, even in front of the vice president of the prince's fan club. Lushan said that she loves Karen dearly and wants to be with him, and the Society of Fans should not hinder her on this path, but rather help her if they really want the guy to be happy. Zatem Edna excused herself and quickly left the room, leaving Leigh Felch alone with her thoughts. After watching her new acquaintance leave, Josephine thought for a minute. She had not expected events to take such a turn. Ultimately, the vice president came to the conclusion that the Archduke's granddaughter was much smarter than she seemed, because the prince, although born out of wedlock, was still third in line for the imperial throne. Lushan hurried along the corridor of the salon where they sold clothes for aristocrats, and she felt an incredible lightness in her soul. She felt good because she was finally able to speak out. While searching for Jess, Edna wandered through the corridors until she suddenly saw a handkerchief lying on the floor. The Archduke's granddaughter began to look around and saw a guy walking past her. The older sister called out to the stranger and respectfully apologized for distracting him. Then Lucian handed him the handkerchief, which she had already managed to pick up and examine. The boy was embarrassed and confused, and while he was choosing words of gratitude, Edna had already managed to wave her hand at him and went on to look for her younger brother. Finally, having collected his thoughts, the stranger asked the departing girl what her name was, to which the Duke's daughter gave a direct and truthful answer. The young man also gave his name and status. He turned out to be the eldest son of Count Bertro named Jagan. But Edna didn't even turn around. She just said that it was time for her to go and quickened her pace. Returning home, the Count's young heir immediately went to his father's office as his father wanted to tell him something very important. The parent invited his offspring for a reason. The fact is that he already knew that the Archduke's grandchildren would be at the ball, which meant that his son could try his luck and propose to Edna Demeret. However, Jagan barely listened to the head of the Bertro family. He was still clutching the handkerchief in his hand. It seemed to the young man that it still retained the warmth from Lucian's touch. After all, the Duke's daughter didn't pass by but stopped, drew attention to herself, and returned the lost item. The guy also remembered how the aristocrat smiled at him, and he thought that this could only mean one thing. She had special feelings for him. Finally, Jagan woke up from his thoughts and returned to reality. He looked at his father and said that his meeting with Edna was not accidental, and they would definitely be together. Then Edna remembered that in addition to Rutman, she knew another person who could also have a positive influence on the situation, and with a greater probability of success. Of course, because her beloved grandfather is not only the head of the Klados clan, but also the owner of the lands on which the Temple of the Ice Sword is located. The granddaughter turned on all her charm and began to persuade her grandfather to invite Karen to visit them in order to settle the trouble that had arisen once and for all. But the relative was not thrilled with this idea. The owner of the castle considered the prince to be a very impressive young man, but he had no idea what he could talk about with the guy since their interests were very different, although he promised to think about it. Jess followed her out of the room. They went almost everywhere together. The Duke's son paused in the doorway for a few seconds, looked at Klados, and said that he supported his sister in her desire to settle all issues with this wizard from the temple as soon as possible. The head of the family smiled and asked his grandson if he wanted to go to the upcoming ball, to which the boy thought for a moment and said that he was not burning with such a desire. Then Jess closed the door behind him, closed his eyes, and began to say what had been building up in his soul lately. According to his version, his sister had fallen madly in love with Karen. Klados was clearly shocked by this news. He never expected that, literally from the doorway, his granddaughter would begin to weave a love affair with a complete stranger. The grandfather jumped up from the sofa and asked the boy to tell him everything he knew on the subject, to which the grandson replied that Edna had never fallen in love with anyone until she saw the photo of the prince. Then the little gossip told his grandfather that the first meeting between Lucian and Delusher went very badly. The guy yelled at her and accused her of being involved with some crazy group of fangirls. The owner of the castle was shocked to learn that some kid dared to insult his granddaughter and even mock her teenage love. He knew Karen a little, and he had previously felt a little sorry for the prince. At the same time, Klados understood that a direct ban on their dates would only worsen the situation and ignite a real fire of love in the young woman's soul, which he did not really want. The grandson and grandfather were very worried about Edna and thought for a long time about what they could do to resolve the situation without injuries and unnecessary worries. Lushan woke up and sat up in bed from a strange feeling. It seemed to her that someone was actively discussing her person, and she could not get rid of this obsessive feeling. The next morning, in a beautiful family castle filled with magical power, they discussed current news during breakfast. The Duke's eldest daughter literally beamed with happiness when she learned that her grandfather had finally decided to throw a real ball. Klados noted that his granddaughter must be the most beautiful and therefore she should go to the city as soon as possible and buy a new dress and decent jewelry. Edna immediately broke into a smile and literally beamed with happiness because a great idea had come to her. True, Jess and grandfather, who were sitting at the table, did not take this proposal very kindly, but it consisted of the fact that Sir Karen must be invited to the ball. It was clear that the relatives were worried about the girl, and most of all about her moral and psychological state, because her love seemed to them exclusively in a negative light. However, Kletos could not allow the misunderstanding that had arisen to grow in scale, and therefore he actually sent the prince a personal invitation to the upcoming ball. Lushan was simply happy, because now she would not only have a real chance to restore relations with the guy, but also the opportunity to develop the fragile connection that was emerging between them. Harris Demeretta literally glowed with joy and noted that today was a beautiful day, and the food this morning was incredibly tasty and aromatic like never before. Jess and Grandpa were very pleased to see Edna in such an elevated mood, and so they decided that for the sake of her happiness, they could tolerate some boy who imagined himself to be someone unknown. Meanwhile, at the Ice Sword Temple, they were also preparing for the upcoming holiday, and the guests were discussing and planning their visit. The werewolf approached the prince and asked him to take him with him to this event, as his magical intuition told him that they should be there together. Karen was a little surprised by his familiar's desire, and assumed that he would be uncomfortable there since under the cover of invisibility, someone could step on him or push him. Delusher knew the Archduke as a strong and strong-willed man, and he did not want to get into an awkward situation. But Kaon replied that he would shrink to a small wolf cub, and everyone loved and cuddled them. The prince thought that the owner of the castle would not allow his granddaughter to manipulate him for her whim, and his pet thought that his savior was probably an aristocrat and could well end up at the ball. The young wizard patted his familiar on the cheek and smiled, suggesting that he wanted to be the center of attention, to be properly hugged and petted. Karen thought a little more and eventually agreed to fulfill Kaon's request, but noted that this was an extremely important event for him, so he needed to behave with dignity and not fall flat on his face. Kaon promised that he would behave like a model werewolf puppy and leave only positive memories of himself among the guests at the ball. And the familiar also thought that someday he and his master would still find the means and the way to punish those who killed their family. But he also knew that revenge is a dish that is served cold. And even though their small pack consists of only 2 fighters together, these friends are capable of moving mountains and turning the whole world upside down. Demeretta was in full swing in the city shop for nobles. The new dress jewelry and hairstyle, everything was dazzling, and struck the eyes of anyone who had the chance to see this incredible beauty, and indeed many people worked on this image. For several hours now, the shop workers had been busy offering the young lady more and more new dresses and outfits. The older sister didn't even try on all the available clothing options, but not because she didn't have enough time, but because she had already made up her mind and didn't want to look for anything further. The maids who were helping Edna were very upset when they realized that a lot of items from their large collection would remain lying untouched without being tried on. Jess had been patiently waiting for his sister in the next room all this time, and finally when the girl came out, he asked if she was ready for the ball now. Instead of answering, the sister ran up to her brother, hugged him, and showed him to the store employees, noting that the Duke's son must look dazzling, which made the girls very happy. And when the resisting younger brother was taken behind the screen, Edna asked him for forgiveness and smiled slyly, looking after the boy. But not everything was so good and carefree. The healing effect that Karen's touch had on Lucian was gradually ending, which meant that the pain and the risk of possible fainting were returning. To regain some strength, the Duke's daughter opened the door to the guest room where she could sit down and rest. But Edna never expected to see there the man who literally changed all her plans some time ago. Judging by Josephine's face, she was as surprised as the Duke's heiress. However, Leigh Felch immediately came to her senses, jumped up from her seat, and began to joyfully greet the heiress of Demiret, reminding her of the day when they met in the Temple of the Ice Sword. The vice president bowed politely and remarked that from now on Edna could call her simply Jaws, thus she wanted to emphasize her benevolent attitude towards the aristocrat. As Edna got to talking, she realized that Josephine had come to town for the same purpose as she had to choose a dress for the upcoming party. Leigh Felsa spoke about her father receiving an invitation to the event, and also shared the news that Prince Karen is also planning to attend the ball. Lushan suddenly felt unwell because she imagined how a crowd of girls from the fan club would surround her betrothed, and he would be defenseless and confused because he would find himself in an awkward situation. The Duke's heiress had already made a lot of efforts to achieve their meeting, and now everything could be destroyed, and Karen would turn away from her forever, or maybe even marry someone else. Edna looked closely at Josephine and asked her if she knew any girls from the club who were not just dreaming of flirting, but were seriously thinking about marrying a wizard from the temple. Lee Felcha laughed and then explained that the prince was certainly handsome, but his status as an illegitimate child in terms of marriage was a deal-breaker for any girl from a noble family. Despite all his virtues, including the presence of magical abilities, Sir Karen remains only a handsome young man with a tragic fate and cannot be considered as a groom. All members of the club understand this and therefore prefer to only observe the prince and discuss his person without taking any active steps aimed at marriage. Edna listened to the vice president and could not believe her ears. It turned out that all this excitement around Deluche was just a bright performance having no other purpose than entertainment. A wave of anger and indignation washed over her, causing Lucien to tighten her grip on the hem of her dress so as not to inadvertently reveal her emotions. The Duke's daughter thought about the fact that a community of fans is not only the desired fame, success, and popularity, it is also a great force that can cover an idol with a glass dome. Edna asked why the girls were behaving like this with Karen. It was unfair and in some ways cruel. Josephine was extremely surprised by such a question. For her club, the prince had always been something like a strange animal that people go to see at the zoo, nothing more. Lucien added that if the young ladies really have warm and bright feelings for Deluche, then they should change the policy of their organization and start to really help him. They have the power not only to provide material support to the guy through membership fees, but also to try to change the opinion of those around him. Then their work will have real effect. Lee Felcha listened to Edna with her mouth open in amazement. She would never have thought that an aristocrat from a good family would say such words. Then Josephine thought for a moment and suggested that the Duke's daughter had been careless enough to fall in love with an illegitimate heir of imperial blood. Harris Demeretta noisily put her cup of tea on the saucer. She decided that there was no point in hiding her feelings, even in front of the vice president of the prince's fan club. Lucien said that she loves Karen dearly and wants to be with him, and the Society of Fans should not hinder her on this path, but rather help her if they really want the guy to be happy. Zatem Edna excused herself and quickly left the room, leaving Lee Felch alone with her thoughts. After watching her new acquaintance leave, Josephine thought for a minute. She had not expected events to take such a turn. Ultimately, the vice president came to the conclusion that the Archduke's granddaughter was much smarter than she seemed, because the prince, although born out of wedlock, was still third in line for the imperial throne. Lucien hurried along the corridor of the salon where they sold clothes for aristocrats, and she felt an incredible lightness in her soul. She felt good because she was finally able to speak out. While searching for Jess, Edna wandered through the corridors until she suddenly saw a handkerchief lying on the floor. The Archduke's granddaughter began to look around and saw a guy walking past her. The older sister called out to the stranger and respectfully apologized for distracting him. Then Lucien handed him the handkerchief, which she had already managed to pick up and examine. The boy was embarrassed and confused, and while he was choosing words of gratitude, Edna had already managed to wave her hand at him and went on to look for her younger brother. Finally, having collected his thoughts, the stranger asked the departing girl what her name was, to which the Duke's daughter gave a direct and truthful answer. The young man also gave his name and status. He turned out to be the eldest son of Count Bertro named Jagan. But Edna didn't even turn around. She just said that it was time for her to go and quickened her pace. Returning home, the Count's young heir immediately went to his father's office as his father wanted to tell him something very important. The parent invited his offspring for a reason. The fact is that he already knew that the Archduke's grandchildren would be at the ball, which meant that his son could try his luck and propose to Edna Demerette. However, Jagan barely listened to the head of the Bertro family. He was still clutching the handkerchief in his hand. It seemed to the young man that it still retained the warmth from Lucien's touch. After all, the Duke's daughter didn't pass by but stopped, drew attention to herself, and returned the lost item. The guy also remembered how the aristocrat smiled at him, and he thought that this could only mean one thing. She had special feelings for him. Finally, Jagan woke up from his thoughts and returned to reality. He looked at his father and said that his meeting with Edna was not